Shabbat Shalom. In Mount Zion's statement that we have about ourselves called our derech, our path to 2040, language we developed over a couple of years, we say that as a Jewish congregation, we will inspire Jewish experiences, stories, and practices, and then the next thing, learn from Jewish history as we continue to innovate. So tonight, as Moses speaks in this week's Parsha about the Israelites' history, as we begin the book of Deuteronomy, I want to look at how we learn from history. And as we are, as I mentioned, in the low point in the Jewish calendar with Tisha B'Av, literally the 9th day of Av, tomorrow night, how do we speak of the most challenging moments that we have experienced? There are three options. First, we can touch the pain through retelling the hard stories to get to the emotional empathy for our ancestors, and then the moral empathy for others going through similar hardship. Number two, we can ask, how did we survive? Where did our resilience come from? And number three, we can ask, why did it happen? On the first option, touching the pain, we will be reading Eicha, the book of Lamentations, tomorrow night, where we cannot escape the grief. Lamentations is one of the Megillot, one of the scrolls. It is said to have been written by Jeremiah at the time of the destruction of the first temple, and it spares no one. And we feel, as you read through it, just the heartache of what war can do to people. It begins, Eicha yashva vadad ha'ir rabati am, alas, lonely sits the city, once great with people. Bitterly she weeps in the night, her cheek wet with tears. There is none to comfort her. Of all her friends, all her allies have betrayed her. They have become her foes. What's fascinating is that our tradition doesn't let us just sit with that grief. The Midrash on that very first verse, Eicha Rabbah, has Rabbi Nehemiah saying the language of Eicha, the book of Lamentations, is only about lament. But then Rabbi Yehuda says the language of Eicha is only about rebuke. Tisha B'Av requires us not to recall, but to feel our people's grief over the centuries. That's Rabbi Nehemiah's point about lament. But Rabbi Yehuda says, how can it only be to feel without calling us to our responsibilities? A rebuke about our own behaviors and the empathy we need to feel toward others. Our retelling of our history, or better, what Professor Yerushalmi says is not history, but actually memory. The way we choose to ritualize our past and remember is both lament and rebuke. On option number two, asking, how did we survive? Resilience comes from focusing on one's agency and believing that things will get better, but not too much better. We want to pull ourselves back from false hope that doesn't ring true. There's a messianism in our tradition that is always about things are going to be better, the Messiah is going to come, but the rabbis always try to temper that and saying, yes, but first you have to make justice, first you have to bring this. Right now, we'll talk more about this later, but I was in Israel just a couple weeks ago, and there is a messianism that is happening and catching fire that is dangerous. Tomorrow in the portion, Devarim, Moses starts his speech to the Israelites in chapter 1 of Deuteronomy, telling them their history through his perspective. He does not start, and this is fascinating, he does not start with the Exodus, though that would make sense. He doesn't speak of Egypt, but with the moment of leaving Sinai. perhaps to remind the Israelites of their agency, the possibility that they are on a mission from God to be a light to the nations. By the way, as an aside, Moses' recollection of history is kind of kind to himself. He takes credit for his father-in-law's suggestion, as recounted in the book of Exodus, for tapping others as leaders of groups. He kind of thinks that was his idea 40 years later. And as opposed to what we read in the book of Numbers, he blames the Israelites for asking for scouts to scout the land. In Numbers, it's actually his idea, but in Deuteronomy, he kind of forgets that. So that moment is we're in the beginning of Deuteronomy, about the 10 spies who bring back the bad report, and then 40 years of wandering and an entire generation dying before the next generation could enter the promised land. Point being, sometimes our history teaches us that we don't all survive, but that our descendants will. 1,400 years later, as the Romans marched into Jerusalem, when we ask, how did we survive the destruction of the temples, we don't actually often look at the stories of how bad it was. We fail to note often the actual destruction. We talk about the ingenuity of survival, which makes it a little more palatable. We talk about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that story. Many of you have heard it before. I'll just recount it briefly. Instead of talking about the destruction of the temple, we talk about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who becomes the leader of the next generation, who transforms Judaism from a temple-based sacrificial tradition to a prayer-based rabbinic tradition in Yavne. He escapes through this ingenious way, through a coffin, through his zealot nephew, who brings him out into a place where he can meet with Vespasian, who is the general, and he tells Vespasian, you are going to be the emperor, and Vespasian says, how dare you? I am not the emperor, and just then he gets the message that the Caesar has died, and he is the emperor. So Vespasian grants Yochanan ben Zakkai 3 wishes, and of those 3 wishes, he does not ask for the impossible, and in realpolitik, you can blame him. You can say, why didn't he ask him not to destroy the temple? But instead he says, give me Yavne, give me a nice beachfront property near Tel Aviv, where I can set up my academy. He does a few more things. So the point is, it's a realistic ask that the rabbis criticize, but again, this is about how we survived. And again, when we look at survivors and their stories of how they survived, it is often through saving their own lives, no matter what. But we don't think about the fact that Yochanan ben Zakkai had to leave behind his sister and his nephew and all the other tragedies of that moment. That part gets us into the third part, the third question, which is, why does it happen? Why did it happen? And here I just want to say, I hinted at this, but I will say that I spent a week in Jerusalem at the Hartman Institute, where I've studied before many times. I was able to get into Israel just as the skies were opened up after the 12-day war with Iran. And I will tell you, once I was in Israel, it felt like war wasn't happening. Even though there was a night where a missile came in from Yemen, we all had to go to the safe room, mixing with all the people in the hotel, which was a fascinating sociological experiment in of itself. Thankfully, we were safe and all was fine. But at the Hartman Institute, we were studying with some of the most incredible teachers of this moment who are trying to promote liberal Zionism at a time when it is very challenging. And among the people we learned from was Tal Becker, who has led the negotiations for Israel with the Palestinians. He also he went to The Hague to defend Israel against the charges of genocide in a very thoughtful way. I'm not going to talk about all of that. I'm going to talk about Yehuda Kurtzer, who is the president of Hartman, who spoke about what we do when we ask, why does it happen? Why do bad things happen? The Jewish turn is always to look to our own actions. And that can be really hard. So why was the first temple destroyed? It was because of our idolatry. Why was the second temple destroyed? It was for sinat chinam, causeless hatred that we had amongst ourselves. That theology means that there's some reason that this bad thing happened. We brought it on ourselves. And again, that's the problematic part. The positive part about it is we start thinking about our own behavior and what we can do better. Here is the part that Yehuda Kurtzer taught me that I did not know, because we often talk about what happens around the time of the destruction and what the Israelis were doing at that time. He brings us back to the Maccabees and to this text with Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, who are two brothers who are fighting over becoming the chief priest, the head priest, and the head of the Jewish community. It is the year 65 BCE, and those who know your history, it's just 2 years before the Romans come in. And here's what they say in Talmud. Our rabbis taught, when the kings of the Hasmonean house laid siege to one another, Hyrcanus was outside and Aristobulus was inside. And this proves that the rabbis actually knew their history. Speaking of history, every day they would lower down denarii, the money in a basket outside the walls, and every day they would raise up animals for daily sacrifices, meaning even though they were fighting, they maintained the daily sacrifices in the temple through this way of maintaining it by, even though the warring party was outside, they would bring the animals, and the party on the inside would pay for it. There was one elder who knew the Greek language. He spoke to them in Greek. He said to them, as long as they are busy with divine worship, they will not be given over into your hands. On the next day, they lowered down to them the cash in the basket, and they sent up to them a pig. When it reached halfway up the wall, it dug its hooves into the wall. The land of Israel shook for 400 Persian miles. There was an earthquake. End of text. Very typical of the rabbinic text. And a challenging text, but what it means is that 103 years before the destruction of the temple, this internal battle where, as Rabbi Yehuda Kurtzer puts it, choosing political survival over spiritual survival led to the ultimate destruction of the temple. The rabbis were critiquing their ancestors for making the wrong choices, which had terrible consequences. And I share the story because many with power are making decisions, and let's be generous, that they believe are the right choices. The consequences of those decisions will have irreparable impacts on all of our futures. With Tisha B'Av tomorrow night, we mourn in order to feel collective grief, and most importantly, to remember that, and here's the key part, we are a community. When we do this together, we are a community, and together we have agency and power. As we remember our history, may we feel empathy for ourselves and for others, honor survival and resilience, and as we seek to understand why things happen as they do, let us learn lessons from the past and know that political survival for its own sake will not endure. There are necessary sacrifices to make to maintain our moral and spiritual purpose, and by fostering character traits of netzach, endurance, and ometz lev, courageous heart, we can live to see better days. Ken Yehi Ratzon, be this our will and God's will. Amen.